Good morning and welcome to our event for today. My name is Daniel Cope and I am from the British Computer Society. I am also the Vice Chairman of the Data Management Specialist Group. This event is co-sponsored by the British Computer Society Data Management Specialist Group and DAMA UK. And thank you all for joining for our virtual conference of Making Data Good for Society. BCS is a professional body for computing with a mission to make IT better for society. The Data Management Specialist Group promotes better use of data throughout the industry, and our mission is to nurture the community of data professionals in the UK who champion the values of data management. This is one of a number of events this week which are taking place, and hopefully a number of you are able to join us for sessions. Our sessions take place every day at 11 a.m. and 4 p.m. So please do join us this afternoon as after this event. He says, bringing up his slide. The British Computer Society is obviously the Royal Chartered Institute as well, and we have a professional publication. And thanks to the work undertaken by the BCS, we have a large repository of books. And you are, thanks to this virtual conference, able to access those books at a discounted rate. You will be able to get 30% off list prices using discount code BCS Data across all of these related titles. There are a number of other fantastic books in the BCS bookshop, so I do encourage you to go and have a look if you have time during the day to enable you to really take value and insight and grow from after this conference if you wish to continue to learn further from other experts. The code is valued, works from the 13th to the 19th of June, and you can go to the link there on screen for those titles. So before we jump in, to let you know, we are recording this session today, and these will be available on the BCS Members Group YouTube channel and the DMAN website after the event. We are very lucky to have a Drawrism with us today. They are capturing the event this week in a fun and engaging digital visualization and producing a visual agenda for this conference. So look for these after the event, and we will also run through what Matt has produced towards the end. You are all muted, but we'd welcome you to ask any questions for our presenters. And so please put your questions into the chat and we will ask them to our speaker on your behalf. We'll have about 20 minutes towards the end of today's session to answer any questions. So get your thinking caps on in relation to what questions you might like to ask. And so now for obviously the main course, it is with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Catherine O'Caffey to talk to us on landing the plane around data ethics and where it's hitting the ground today. Over to you, Kathleen. I believe you are on mute. Not a problem at all. Not a problem at all. These things, technology is there to sometimes set us to try. As a reminder, obviously do put them into the chat functionality. Any questions, that you'll find that at the bottom of your screen. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you. Yes, Zoom decided to lose my controls there. Screen sharing is not sharing. Give me a second here. Technology always works perfectly until it actually has to work. Okay, I'll try screen sharing one more time. Okay, the screen should be shared now. Thanks for your patience, everyone. My name is Catherine O'Keefe, as David just said there. Bit of a quick introduction on who I am and what I do, where I work. So Castlebridge is a consultancy focused on data management, specifically strategic data management skills of different sorts, data governance, data ethics. I have been working with Castlebridge since 2013. I also lecture on data ethics and data privacy at the Law Society of Ireland and on University College Dublin's certificate in data governance and data protection. And my colleague Dara O'Brien and myself have published a book in 2018 on ethical data and information management. I also contributed to the data ethics chapter in the DAMA Data Management Book of Knowledge, second edition, and I'm a member of Scotland's National Expert Group on Digital Ethics right now. So there should be a report coming out from that in a few months. That might be something to look forward to. So Castlebridge, as I said, we do a mix of consulting, training, and advisory and research. We've done a good bit of a focus on data ethics in the past few years and had noticed in particular that it is a increasingly fraught topic. It's one that a lot of people are very interested in, but the actual application of how do we do this has been kind of one of the big gaps. So that's one of the reasons that we did write our book, looking at implementing ethics from an information management perspective. So I'm going to try to cover a lot in the next few minutes. So I'll start with a bit of a state of the nation. Where are we? What are the issues with data ethics right now? Some myths that we keep on encountering when it comes to questions of data and ethics in general. Briefly go over some frameworks for thinking about ethics, because if you're going to implement ethics in your organization, particularly when you're looking at data, you have to actually think about how you decide what is good. So if we're talking about what is good, what is ethical, how do we decide that? How does your organization decide that? What are your values? How do you make decisions? And then I'll talk a little bit about ethics and information management and some implementation things. So that's a lot to cover in a few minutes, but I'll do my best. And definitely if you have questions, please put them in the chat box for them to be asked. So as a state of the nation goes, like I said, there's a lot of talk about data ethics is the big thing. If you follow much in the way of the news when it comes to data protection issues and AI and the way it's used in the past several years, there are a lot of things relating to data ethics that are there. It's a very, very current topic. But when it comes to actually moving from everyone talking to it to actually doing it, we're really more in this type of a situation. There's a lot of running around, a lot of talking about it, and a good bit of panic, but actually implementing ethical frameworks in organizations, actually seeing real ethical decision-making when it comes to data is a lot less common than one would hope. So like I said, we do have a lot of constant headlines. These are actually old. I could have updated a lot of these in the last few weeks, but we are constantly looking at how data ethics questions affect our lives. And it is something that is intimately connected with some of the biggest questions that we have right now in the larger impacts of our interaction with technology, the way democracy is supported or works. And pretty much every aspect of our lives has a data ethics question and decision attached to it. So we're looking at everything from the environment. For instance, one of the key papers that caused a rather large controversy in Google right now was looking at the environmental risks of the large language models that Google is using and training upon. So yeah, the carbon consumption and the energy consumption of AI. We're looking at constant questions of manipulation of personal data and manipulation of news using our new technologies for communications, disrupting democracy, civil rights protections. Going back a couple decades, we had US government officials saying we kill people based on metadata. So this is not a new problem, but it's one that is a issue that is constantly becoming more and more in our face and real life affecting us. So one of the things that again becomes very, very current is questions of equality and accountability when we're looking at AI and machine learning in particular. Because if you are basically doing pattern recognition and then instituting that into a model that recognizes patterns and extrapolates or so-called predicts future events or future decisions from past patterns, you are essentially creating a money laundering apparatus for inequality and for prejudiced and biased decisions, because you're basing your predictions on a unequal and unfair past. So again, this is something that is of absolute concern in loan applications, in banking, in criminal justice, all of these questions in job applications. If your CVs are being filtered or screened by an AI that is looking for a particular pattern that of past employees, then you're stuck if you don't match that particular pattern. So those are just a few things, but a lot of what we're seeing in the way people and businesses are responding to this really look like this. It's business as usual. We have a conflagration inferno looming in on us, and very, very likely to hit us very, very soon. And one of the other responses, again, we're talking a lot about having this need for ethics in our organization, this need for having ethical decision-making embedded into our processes and data ethics. A lot of the time what you get is the equivalent of greenwashing in organizations. We now have ethics washing, because what has been found out is that, yes, with all things equal, when people have a choice as consumers, they will generally prefer to choose the more ethical organization. If they can, if they have a free choice, they will choose they will choose the ethical option generally when it comes to deciding between one service and another. So it is a commercial differentiator, but at the same time, if it's a commercial differentiator, if it's a question of reputation, then a lot of the time what we get is less actual ethics than the attempt for an appearance at ethics without actually changing core modes of business. Or core modes of decision-making, or really thinking about how the use of data does affect people, potential benefits and harms. So here's a few of the myths that we start seeing a lot when we're talking to people around data. And this is one that I've heard many times over. Unfortunately, I've actually heard this exact quote in a presentation given bragging about wonderful uses of location technology in particular, if I remember correctly, at a conference. We look for creative uses for data and put them into action. We'll worry about the privacy and other issues later. That unfortunately is not a possible thing. What happens if you worry about the privacy and other issues later is that you end up with a product that is by design not going to suffice for ensuring that people's privacy is respected. One example of this, and it's just one of many, but Facebook are very easy to beat up upon for this, is just the nature of Facebook by design. Everything is by design open, and you have to crawl back and try to figure out what you want to make private. And every time they change something, the options change. You generally have to crawl back and make things private again. So it's the opposite of building privacy respecting technologies where by default, people's privacy are respected. Now, again, privacy is just one ethical issue, but it is one that often does have very, very large and ongoing impacts on people's lives in many ways. So when you're thinking about minimizing harm to people, one of the things that you do need to think about when it comes to data processing, one of the first harms that will happen when you process people's data is that violation of their privacy. So benefits and harms, you need to consider those in building the project or whatever it is, your new processing of data, so that you can't just say, oh, we'll think about that later. It has to be one of the things that you consider the potential risks and harms and how to balance those with benefits, how to get as much benefit as you can out of data in a win-win situation from the beginning in the design process. And design is a very important word here. So again, one of the big myths that you'll hear about technology and use of data is this idea that technology is neutral. This is something that pretty much was debunked philosophically back in the 30s. So it hasn't changed there. Again, if you just think about the word technology, technologies are tools. We build tools for particular purposes. And if you think a tool is neutral, just think about how left-handed scissors are. If you're left-handed and you're used to using scissors designed for right-handed people, you know that is not a neutral decision choice for design. And again, if you're right-handed, find someone who has a pair of left-handed scissors and see the continual effects on their dignity of a simple tool. So tools are something that you design. They're something that you design for a purpose. Technology, the way we design how we use data, our various technology and tools, they are not neutral. They are the endpoint of many, many human decisions on purpose and design. And they are a culmination of many, many different disciplines, ways of understanding things, and value sets that we assume. So technology is never neutral. What we build to process data with, the things that we use data for, data itself is not neutral. We don't grab data out of the air. We create and curate data sets according to specific parameters, according to specific decisions of what is quality. So that is not neutral. So again, never ever assume that a tool that is used is neutral and it can be equally used for good or for bad. It's design. And another design issue that I've unfortunately seen quite a bit when talking to developers in particular is the idea that you design for the main user, you don't have to worry about the edge cases. A quote I've heard from someone who was working in HR and dealing with HR systems and was very, very frustrated with the systems that his organization had used was that they'd been sold something and been told, okay, that's fine, 90% of your issues will be handled by this system, fine. The ones that don't, that's just edge cases. Well, 90% of his work was the edge cases. So that is something that you must design for if you are considering developing a new process and handling data that has to do with people, or again, if you are a developer of technology yourself. So you must design for the edge cases. The edge cases tend to be where the most harm happens. The edge cases tend to be the places that really, really affect people. So they must be designed for. One example of this would be the use of smart homes technology and also smartphones. An edge case that was not designed for or considered for was the weaponization of smart home technologies by domestic abusers. So when you have an ability of an abuser to actually literally gaslight people by turning their own homes against them, locking them out of the ability to turn on or turn off lights, locking them in or out of their own houses, that is a very, very serious impact on people. And the assumption by the developers and designers that that was an edge case that didn't need to be worried about too much affected people's lives very, very strongly. So it was not potentially thought about or mitigated harms. And so this is where it comes for all of us in all organizations. Another thing that does tend to happen is the assumption that if you have an ethics team in your organization, that thinking about ethics is their job. And again, a lot of organizations don't have an ethics team. It is everyone's job to think about. You can't just say, I'm just an engineer. We've heard this before. I'm just a soldier. I'm just a doctor. I'm just doing my job. Ethical decision-making is something that we all have to consider whatever role we're in an organization. We have heard this argument before. It didn't work in the Nuremberg trials. So I was only following orders. Did not work. I was only building an app. I was only automating a process. It's the same argument. So those are the myths that I do encounter quite a bit, and they are ones that you need to be aware of and fight back yourself when you are dealing with any questions relating to ethics when handling data, when designing new systems, when testing and thinking about offering a new product. So how do we think about these questions? How do we ask? So there are different ethical frameworks that people work with. Different ways we decide how to figure out, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Is this the right decision? Is this the wrong thing to do? So we have various ways of thinking about them. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time, but the main reason I'm doing this is to ask questions, to think yourself. What is your ethical framework? I'll talk, give a little bit of a brief of a couple, but there are a lot of different ways to decide what is right and what is wrong. And there are different things that influence our personal frameworks for understanding what is ethical and what is not. And we may and are very likely to have gaps in our ethical frameworks, just because we don't all have identical experiences. So it's very important to consider, what are we overlooking? What are our oversights? What are our gaps? And make sure that, again, if we have the need to make decisions for an organization, we have multiple voices in the room. So in the disability community, one of the ways this is described as nothing about us without us. Making sure that the people who are most likely to be harmed do have a voice, so that they can raise the issues that they see and that they're actually listened to. Because again, I'm not disabled myself. I'm obviously white. I do not have the same experiences of, for instance, ableism and different access issues that people with disabilities would have. I do not have the same experience of how I interact with society as someone of a racialized minority would have. And so they will interact with data. They will be treated differently by our data processing and our data management in many cases than I would. So the effects on other demographics need to be considered, and their perspectives need to be brought in to ensure that we are not missing out on something that would be really obvious to other people when we're trying to decide, is there a harm here we need to avoid? So one of the ethical viewpoints that I find useful for this is called the ethics of care. And it's basically, it's a response to gaps in some other ethical frameworks, such as the ethics of justice, and also to Lawrence Kohlberg's model of moral development. But it's looking at the relationship between, for instance, a mother and child, or a caretaker in a medical situation and the person they're caring for, and saying that this is actually a good way to look at modeling ethical decision-making and the required skills to understand what is ethical. So one of the first kind of core attributes in the ethics of care is the ability or proclivity to become aware of a need, attentiveness. Then there's a responsibility, a willingness to respond and take care of that need, the competence and skill to actually be able to do so, and the awareness of the differences in power there and potential for abuse. So that can actually be a good way to model how your organization looks at solving problems, rather than doing a kind of a blockchain. We've got a great tech, let's see if we can find a solution that'll find a problem that'll actually solve. So rather than going, finding a tech solution and then trying to figure out if there's a problem that will fit, looking to see what the actual issues and problems are in your organization, in society, the needs of your customers, and having that attentiveness to respond to and care for those needs. Another thing that, from a business ethics perspective, is the shareholder or stockholder theory concept of maximizing profit. So profit max, only looking at the monetary shareholder value, and the purpose of the firm there is to only make money for the shareholders and maximize profits. From an ethical perspective, the only thing we're really looking at there is bare confirmation or appearance of confirmation to laws and regulations, and avoiding at least the appearance of fraud and deception. So the ethical focus there, that is the ethical framework that many organizations work with. It's compliance with the letter of the law, or at least appearing to comply with the law. Another business ethics framework that is quite common, and is popularized by R. Edward Freeman, with what's called stakeholder theory. And what you're doing here is you're identifying the various stakeholders in your organization, determining the interests and benefits and their rights of all the various different types of stakeholders, and seeking the best balance of interest. Now, this is still, profit is one of those interests, so that doesn't go away at all. It's a key interest in many ways, and the stakeholders, shareholders are stakeholders as well. So we're not losing that interest in profit for the organization. We're not losing the interest in ensuring that the organization benefits in general, and all the stakeholders in the organization benefits. But your ethical focus is looking more at balancing rights and interests of all the stakeholders. So it ends up being a more sustainable mode of framing how your values of the organization are. What you can occasionally see too, and this is generally more in not-for-profit organizations, is what's more of a social contract theory, which is again having clear value-focused decisions of our ethical focus is on fulfilling particular values, and much more of a strong focus on the finding sorry, I'm losing words here, optimizing the welfare of society, developing mechanisms to ensure that we are identifying any sort of dehumanizing processing, and eliminating those. And again, thinking about different types of tangible or intangible aspects of well-being or benefit or good. Again, this doesn't mean that profit is not thought of in this social contract theory type focus, but it's not the main focus in that particular type of an organization. So that's again why it tends to be more charities and not-for-profits. Whereas both stakeholder and shareholder or stockholder theory, profit is very much a key benefit in general. So when it comes to business ethics and this idea of understanding that we're looking at, in stakeholder theory, the various interests and rights of various stakeholders in an organization. One of the things that R. Edward Freeman said is that each stakeholder group has a right not to be treated as a means to some end, but as basically an end in of themselves. And therefore, they must participate in determining the future or direction of the firm in which they have a stake. That is pretty much coming back to Kant's second formulation of his categorical imperative, the idea of treating people not just as a means to an end, but as an end in of themselves, as a person that has value. So that is very, very much a solid deontological ethical standpoint there, in that we have a clear value here, we have a clear rule that in this form of framing things, we must follow this rule, treat people as people, not as objects. So that's, again, one of the things to think about. And that's something, again, when we're talking about data, a lot of our big data analytics, a lot of our ideas of monetizing data tend to result in what we call datafication of people, and losing the idea that that's actually a person behind all of those numbers and data points, that, that there is a person there that is being impacted. Data is people. And so again, one of the frameworks that is very important here is this idea of balancing fundamental rights. From a privacy perspective and a data protection perspective, it's actually very necessary from GDPR and now the UK GDPR to do this balancing of fundamental rights when you're processing the data of people. So this is where ethics and compliance come right back into each other with legal compliance. Both the EU GDPR and the UK GDPR require that when you're processing data, when you're doing new things with data about people, or that relates to identifiable people, you have to consider the potential risks to their fundamental human rights when their data is processed. And you have to balance and minimize those risks. You have, if you're relying on the legitimate interests of your organization to do something with their data, that has to be balanced. You have to do a balancing test with the balancing the interests of your organization versus the impacts on the fundamental rights, freedoms, and interests of the data subject. So we are looking at, from a legal compliance perspective, also a data ethics perspective. And if you go into looking at GDPR and data protection law, you are looking at ethical questions. And when it comes to AI, we've been having a lot over the past few years of focus on developing principles to ensure ethical uses of AI. And so we've had a lot of different publications of different sets of principles and guidelines for trustworthy or ethically aligned AI, responsible AI. That's a starting place. But where do we go from principles and guidelines to actually doing things? How do we use those principles to guide business and decision-making around data is the next question. There's a gap. So on one hand, we've got a lot of codes of ethics in businesses, but how do we get those to ensure that we're actually bringing them into reality, and that these codes of ethics actually are reflected in the decisions and the actions of people in the organization? We can have academic teaching on ethics, we can have professional training. We need to make sure that our principles end up being reflected in the outcomes of our organization. So that's one of the things that Dara and I looked at in our book quite a bit. One of the things we also did was we looked at how ethics is present and related to various information management disciplines. So I obviously don't have time to go through the entire book here, but just to give you an idea, again, chapter 3 of our book talks about ethics when it comes to privacy and analytics. I gave you a little bit of a brief parallel there discussing that. One of the things we look at as well is how ethics are embedded in and inherent in the Zachman framework for information architecture. And basically, if you look at the motivation column, that's where the ethics are there. What's your motivation for a particular action? That is one thing, but really one of the key parts of the book, one of the reasons that we started with the book. My colleague Dara is a big fan of W. Edwards Deming. And I made a bet with him probably 5 years ago now that just about any quote that he pulled up with Deming that it was about quality, that you would be able to replace the word quality with ethics. I won the bet. One of the things that you can think about is you can look at questions of data ethics from a data quality perspective. You can say that these principles and the outcomes of these principles are quality characteristics of our data. So to have a quality information management, it must also be ethical information management. One of the things that we do in chapter 8 of the book is actually look at different types of quality characteristics for ethical data. And then Obviously, if you look at the DAMA wheel here, they do mention data ethics. Like I mentioned, I did help to edit the ethics chapter, which is very basic and focuses a lot on privacy. But it does start there. We do have principles in ethics, and these are foundational activities in data management, and they're a core part of data governance. So you can absolutely look at the questions of information ethics from a data governance point of view and take the lessons learned from implementing data governance in your organization to the same issues you will find if you need to implement an information ethics program in your organization. So here's an example of what we were looking at with quality. So one of the things that we did here is we basically adopted Joseph Juron's statements relating to the quality crisis. And we said we can say very, very similar things about information ethics. So the most obvious evidence in this crisis in information ethics is concerns about algorithmic bias, potential for misuse of big data technologies, and immense risks of abuse. So those are our huge costs of poor quality information here. The crisis isn't going away in the foreseeable future. Technological information evolution will go on, and so will the impacts. So our traditional approaches to IT project management aren't adequate. In a sense, our adherence to those traditional ways has helped create the crisis. And so we need to chart a new course, create a different way of thinking about ethics and information management. And this has to go through all areas of the organization. You can't just have a ethics function on the side that gets treated like a mushroom. You have to make sure that, like data governance, it's everyone's problem, it's everyone's responsibility. And so one of the ways that we describe this in Castlebridge is we started again with this question of outcomes and with the question of data governance and architecture and the need to communicate about data throughout an organization. So we started with Rick Meiss's Amsterdam model for information architecture and that requirement that when it comes to the understanding of actually getting the outcomes we need, whether it's a process outcome or an information outcome, there must be communication across the organization through all the various verticals and various silos in an organization to understand the importance of data and to understand that, to ensure that data does flow properly throughout the various silos in an organization. And the same thing is true for ethics. But what we decided when we were talking about here is that when it comes to communication about ethics, we all personally have our own, like I said earlier, ethical frameworks and ways of deciding what is right and wrong. We have our own understanding of ethics. So we have our own individual ethic. An organization develops itself a organizational culture. So you have a organizational ethic as well, a common set of values in an organization. And whatever society we all live in, our society also has our own cultural set of values and understanding as right as wrong. So we have the ethic of society and the ethic of the organization and also our individual ethics. In that there may or may not be congruence. If you're stuck in an organization that has a very, very different ethical framework, very, very different set of values to you, you will probably be very miserable. And that will cause friction. There's also in many cases a situation where the organization does not have a congruent ethical framework to society. So there can be friction there. Now, there are ways that you will see this, and some of that is in the outcomes. If the outcomes of the organizational processes and decisions are not what society expects, you have friction, you have unexpected outcomes, you have outcomes that people aren't happy with. So there are ways that can be influenced as well to try to make things either communicated a little bit clearer or to influence the organization, or in some cases organizations try to influence the ethic of society as well. So they try to change people's expectations. So you can have different ways of trying to make that potential gap between expectation and result or outcome to narrow down and create less friction between the ethic of society and the ethic of the organization. So sometimes you'll see that with changing laws and regulations. For instance, introducing new regulations and requirements in order to force the change of behavior on organizations' parts. You'll also see organizations trying to influence society via lobbying, by standard industry practices, and via advertising and communication in different ways to explain what an outcome is likely to be. So when it comes to actually bringing the questions of outcomes there and making sure that we do implement data governance and ethical information governance, what we're looking at again is implementation of principles into the entirety of the organization to ensure that the outcomes are what are expected and in line with our values and principles. So our ethical values inform our principles in an organization. We start with those broad principles and guidelines. Those inform our policies. Policies guide procedures, which are executed through processes. And what you have there is your outcomes. You have controls to try to mitigate risk of undesired outcomes there as well. So you have prevention, detection, remedial action. And again, as part of a constant quality control process, you have that feedback. Are the outcomes in line with your principles and what overall values and goals of your organization? So part of that is through governance. And that's really, again, the structural thing. That's where we land the plane. So that's where I got my, the title of the talk from. Is we start with that overall, in the air, lovely view, broad principles of the organization. How do we actually bring those down to the ground? And it is through that implementation of principles through our policies, procedures, processes, and controls, and having that all overseen by governance. So governance feeding into that at every stage. Another thing to be considering, again, I mentioned earlier, the individual decision-making. A lot of what is required for ensuring actual implementation of ethical principles in organizations is ensuring that you have the right atmosphere and support for ethical decision-making at every stage in an organization. So if you look at something like the Wells Fargo scandal several years back now, Wells Fargo had plenty of codes of ethics, and they said that they were very strong on ethics and that they supported ethical decision-making on the part of their workers. But what they incentivized was the exact opposite. So there are moderators on the decision that a person takes. So walking from this slide from left to right is we start with an ethical issue, and somebody, the person on the ground making a decision, has to make a decision. Part of it is they have a certain stage of moral development of their own ethical framework and understanding what is the right and wrong thing to do. But they don't make that decision in a vacuum. So this is an adaptation of Linda Trevino's work on moral decision-making. She talks about there being moderators on the decision or action taken by an individual. It's not just their moral and cognitive development that results in a ethical or unethical decision. We have individual moderators. For instance, does the person making the decision feel confident in their own decision making? Do they have the support? Do they actually believe they can influence the situation with their decision? Or do they believe that they're just a cog in a wheel and it doesn't matter what they do? So those are individual moderators or things that will influence the person individually. There's also the situation they're making a decision in. So what is their immediate job context? What is enforced or reinforced? What are the other pressures they're working with? What is the organizational culture and governance? So this is all ethic of the organization questions. And again, what is the nature of their work? Can they step up and contribute? Can they resolve a moral conflict? Are they in a organization that is very, very structured and you obey what your boss says? Or is it a more flat structure organization where they feel they have the independence to make decisions? What are their role models? What is incentivized? So anyways, what you do, an action is made by an individual at a point of time looking at an issue. That results in an outcome, whether it's a process outcome or an information outcome, and the experience of the other stakeholders. So the customers, the people who are influenced by or affected by the decision in some way, their experience, again, will give some sort of feedback as to how that did, in fact, affect them and what was the quality of the ethical decision that was made. So those are all things that come into play. And one of the key things I just want to point out here is that the organizational culture and what is incentivized when it comes to what decisions are made is very, very key. And it's, again, it's a data quality question. It's an observer effect thing. What you incentivize, for instance, if you just say we need to fill all the fields, it doesn't matter what the actual input is, you're going to get a very different result by paying people by fields filled than you will if you required a particular quality of result in that field. So as with data quality, what you're looking at is what you're incentivizing when it comes to decision making. And when it comes to organizational culture, this is something, if you've followed what's going on with Google in the past several months, it's been a very good example of where some very, very strong ethical decision makers were coming up against the overall ethic of the organization and the overall values of the organization. So Timnit Gebru is one of the stars in ethical AI right now. She's done an incredible amount of really valuable research work. And she was fired. The trigger for the firing was this paper that herself, her direct boss, Margaret Mitchell, and a few other researchers had published that was basically looking at potential risks to the large language models that Google uses. So it was pointing out that there are risks that need to do. So this was part of her job. She was part of the AI ethics team in Google. She was over an email relating to the censorship of that particular paper, fired very, very abruptly. And then as she was supported by Margaret Mitchell was fired a few weeks later. And it's basically resulted in incredible reputational damage for Google from an AI ethics perspective. They had been actually looking like they were doing some really good work when it came into the question of bringing in responsible AI and ethical AI. But now it basically looks like they were trying to control the narrative and do a lot of ethics washing. So they've lost, researchers have refused to work with them. They've lost some of the key voices that were actually doing really good work in data ethics. And their reputation has been seriously tarnished by this here. So that's just an example there, but it's one of the things that the Irish president has pointed out as well. What he says there is the proliferation of ethical manuals and codes of conduct in whatever professional sectors you're looking at will only be of limited consequence if we do not also ensure their purpose is embraced and understood by and not just enforced upon those for whom they are designed. So when it comes to communicating ethics, it has to be something that is organic to the entire organization or is communicated to and made important to the entire organization. There has to be cultural tone from the top, and it has to be communicated and brought into everyday reality for everyone in the organization. It can't just be a team that's on the side that is then ignored or just used for publicity. It has to be something that is real for the entire organization. And that's really the end of my presentation. So thank you very much. I'm absolutely open for questions.
Thank you, Karen. That was incredibly interesting. And I think you highlighted some really important points around ethics is so important because it has adverse effect on people's lives, and really can change the whole direction of people's lives. I must say, for me, it brings to highlight a thought of processing sexuality data in somewhere like Saudi Arabia. It's legal, but obviously, in my opinion, wholly unethical. So we have a number of questions in the questions box. So if anyone does have any questions, please do pop them into the chat. We will try and get through as many as we possibly can. And we have our first question, which is, to what extent do you see ethics could be introduced systematically into design processes by extending the human factor considerations that should already be being addressed?
That's a good start. I think when it comes to the human factors considerations we have right now, they tend to be very limited. And also, again, what we need to start doing as well is understanding the framework of what questions we're asking and who's asking those questions. So when you have some human factors considerations, again, who's asking the questions, who's bringing up the considerations, and what limits are there at the moment. Also, again, understanding what ethical risks there are. You need to make sure that there's education and training in that, because there's a lot of skill to be developed there, particularly again when it comes to a lot of computer science education, and generally science as in general, a lot of STEM education very maybe briefly once glances over the questions of data ethics in part of a course. And it doesn't, often again, it doesn't actually get addressed by people who are looking at it from a ethics perspective, but it's a quick thing done by a computer science professional who's done very little ethical training in it themselves. So it's bringing in that question of human factors considerations. That's probably a very good entry point. It will need to be expanded, and you'll need to make sure there are more voices in there asking those questions and thinking about what those considerations are.
Definitely. I think you make some very valid points there. And I think it's having an open conversation with people from different backgrounds within that human factor, as obviously you alluded to earlier. We're now just going to pop over to Matt for our drawism. Matt, over to you.
Hello, Dan. Thanks for the invitation. Hopefully you can see some capture on the screen that Glenn will have spotlighted. I'm just going to walk around it very quickly. And if you bear with me a moment while I pick a different color so we can all see what I'm pointing out. Catherine did a little introduction about what her background was, literally. And you can see that that is listed over here on the castle, just for fun. Information management is a fraught area, lots of context, lots of talk, but less action. We've got all the changes that everyone's very familiar with in terms of machine learning and AI and natural language processing. And there's an awful lot of, arguably, ethics washing going on. There's not a lot of application of material. There was a telling story about drone technology and also contextual identification or jigsaw-oriented identification, as you'll see in the image there. So changes here already. It's not the future, it's been here for a while, and it's just changing and moving on in its usual speedy fashion. But we carry on as if things are normal and as if our traditional methods of project management and business will stand, which Catherine said very strongly won't. We're storing up serious problems, to synthesize that slightly. Very strong statement that technology is not neutral, because it's designed by humans who come with prejudices built in and bias, which is why the conversation at the first point of any design is very important. The powerful point about edges and affecting user or customer lives or people, indeed. And the Nuremberg defense got a mention here, and that played in some of the things that Catherine came to towards the end, and I'll come back to that. So an ethical framework, what would it be? And there's a great deal of detail. What do we want to do, which is a positive thing, with what effect? So in design terms, you might think about positive space and negative space as a very top level assessment of that. What about guidance, the ethics of care, and the theories of business? So it's core to everything that we do. And where are we on that spectrum? And this matters because obviously data is people. And GDPR obviously in data processing. Interesting proposition about quality management will be ethical. That's a discussion to have. What do you, and this plays back to the business point that was raised around, I was only following orders. What are you actually incentivizing? And the story about Google had some real resonance. And that's the danger. Not a data mining, but a data mine. And I think that's quite enough from me.
Thank you, Matt. I think, I must say, I think your artistic skills there are far beyond mine. And I think that's a fantastic summary of the talk so far. We do have some more questions, and I'm conscious we are close to 12 o'clock. So we will try and answer as many as we can. We may run over slightly, but obviously if you do need to shoot off, then please do so. We do have a question here, which is somebody made a comment of, I hadn't appreciated that ethics covers getting the breadth of a system functionality requirement appropriate to all types of users who could need to interact with it. So what approach / frameworks would you recommend to avoid unconscious bias when managing these kind of activities?
Again, that's one of the reasons why I asked who's in the room. When it comes down to it, one particular framework will not get everything. So, you know, it's one of the important things is just being mindful, but and making sure that we ask the questions. But when it comes to that question of you know, how can we avoid unconscious bias, in many cases we can't. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we have people who will challenge us and you know, have that diversity of views and experiences, giving the input. So this is where, you know, it is very, very important to make sure that we bring in the voices of those who are affected by the systems and the functionalities that we're creating.
Thank you. So moving to our next question, given that data management is often has less visibility and what may be considered less glamorous than data usage, are ethics of data management also less visible? How do we as data management professionals maintain that visibility and ensure the different stages of the life cycle take place?
That's a very good question. Yeah, it is, but by the nature of data management being less visible, less glamorous, those you know, ethical questions are often less glamorous as well. It's unfortunately pretty much the same question that you have with data management in general. So it's, you know, again, one of the things you can do is you can look at the outcomes, you can find those stories of how this does affect people. Because again, no matter what you know, you're looking at in information management, storytelling is a good way of communication. So finding ways to actually make it concrete for people that, you know, that your management choices you know, do in fact affect real things, real people.
Thank you. And I'm afraid we are at the toll of the hour. Thank you everyone for joining us. Again, this video and seminar was recorded, so you will find this on the BCS Members Group YouTube channel and the DMAN website after the event. You are also very welcome to join us for our event at 4 o'clock. So please do sign up for that. via Eventbrite if you haven't already. And as a reminder, do make use of those BCS book discounts while they last, so that you can further enhance and pick up more around ethics. And we look forward to seeing you at 4 o'clock. Thank you so much for your time, and a particular thank you to you, Catherine, for your fantastic talk.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.